Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Today I'm talking to Sajad Jiyad, my colleague and fellow here at Century International, and the author of a new book, God's Man in Iraq, The Life and Leadership of Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, which was published December 12th and which you can find out more about on our website, tcf.org, or wherever you buy books. Sajad, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, Thanasi.
So today we're going to try and get through a couple of significant things. First, we want to talk about your insights into the significance of Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. Then we want to talk about this new book that you've published. And finally, we want to look ahead at what might come next after the long reign of Sistani ends. So let's just dive right in to the man himself and his significance, which you spent a great deal of your career breaking ground in research about. So why and how is Sistani so important?
Well, thank you, Thanasi. I think it's also the reason why we decided to write or to publish this book. I think the name Sistani is very important to people who live in Iraq, people who have worked in Iraq, people who are involved in sort of policy around Iraq. But for anybody not involved in those or anybody who lives outside Iraq, it might not be familiar to them. You know, who is this guy Sistani? A couple of years ago, the Pope came to visit him in his house in Najaf. And, the Pope doesn't just sort of go anywhere. He's very selective and about his trips. So just thinking about that means that he's obviously a guy who's tremendously important. But why is he important, and for what reason has he been relevant to Iraq and important to Iraq? It's what I try to answer. So Sistani is a figure equivalent to the Pope in Shia Islam. He's the most senior cleric or senior religious leader, and has been like that for over 30 years now. He spent most of his life inside Iraq, living in Iraq since early 50s. And under Saddam's regime, he wasn't permitted to sort of, exercise his leadership. Saddam's regime was attempting to prevent sort of any other leadership emerging, whether it was secular or religious or nationalist. And so after 2003, there was much more freedom, let's say, for somebody like Sistani to exercise his leadership, but it was also because Iraq needed that kind of leadership. So, US invasion and not a clear plan for what happens after. And then, very soon after, you remember the history well, we had the violence and then sectarian civil war. And sort of the only person who had credibility during this very difficult period after 2003 was Sistani, because he was consistent. He talks about Iraqis need to decide their own fate in terms of self-determination, writing their own constitution, choosing their own leaders. They needed to have elections as soon as possible. The US wasn't going to be able to govern Iraq sort of indefinitely. And then even when, the civil war, the sectarian civil war sort of started to get very bloody, Sistani was very consistent saying, look, calling for more violence and fighting and self-defense and all that is just going to add more to the cycle of violence. We need to, inside Iraq, treat each other as brothers, and we're all from the same, background. We're all Iraqis who went through difficult times. We can't now turn on each other. He remained consistent in his messaging. He was trying to prevent further violence. And then when governments were formed, he was always on the case of the politicians. You need to do better. You need to govern better. You need to provide services. You need to be fair and just. You need to make sure that, you avoid corruption, because, we know after 2003, there was a lot of corruption already happening in Iraq. And it just got worse and worse with all the oil money. Sistani is very consistent. I think he picked up a lot of credibility from Iraqis and from foreigners just for being that consistent. He never changed his mind. He's never changed his opinions. He never sought to curry favor with the politicians. He never backed down. I mean, he stood up to Paul Bremer when Bremer was essentially the chief administrator of Iraq, let's say.
Now, there's something different that you show in your work and in this book. So it's not just that this person is let's say a credible figure with an incredibly influential pulpit from which he can provide moral symbolism. You argue and I think convincingly show that he affected real world outcomes in critical, important ways, whether it's de-escalating civil conflict between Iraqis, whether it's creating a pathway towards electoral democracy under the shadow of U.S. occupation, finding a way out of the rise of ISIS and its threat to the integrity of Iraq, and even Iraq's position in the region. I think you showed that time and again, this figure, it's not just that he's messaging or making statements or somehow being a representative of certain views and ideas. He's steering events and outcomes, and that to me makes him different than a figure like the Pope, who is ultimately I guess people argue about this, but who seems to me more like a moral figure, a moral symbol. Whereas in Sistani, you are showing us someone who's an actor, a driver of events. How is it that he has power to shape events and to drive outcomes so pivotally?
So I think Sistani would not describe himself as sort of a political leader or even politically active in that sense. I think he was reluctantly thrust into politics. Let's put it that way. I think the U.S. invasion changed not just his perspective, but I think his directive. He had to become involved. He had to assume more responsibility because the country was going through a difficult phase, because lives were at stake. Now, the secret of why suddenly he gained power, I think, well, first of all, he's lived a long life inside Iraq, focused on, developing his skills as a religious scholar. So people respect that. He didn't have a political background, let's say, and he lived very simple life, in very simple means, monkish in a way. And I think that always sort of that ascetic lifestyle is always appealing to people, much more so than sort of political leaders where people fear that corruption is never far away. And because, a large number of Shia Muslims inside Iraq are religiously conservative. And so they lived decades under the Ba'ath regime where they did not really have any political leadership inside the country. They were all exiled. And so, when people were looking around in 2003 at regime change, when they were looking inside the country for who to look to, there wasn't that many inside the country at all. And those that came in, the exiles that came in, people were sort of disconnected from, they didn't know very well. And, a certain number of them came into Iraq with the help of the Americans, on the back of the US invasion, let's say. So, there was already sort of credibility and trust issues in that sense. And I think Sistani, having remained during the most difficult period under sanctions, following the Gulf War in 91, I think had that respect for the people that he could have left. Saddam tried to deport him. He could have left if he wanted to, but he decided to tough it out. And I think that put him in a good position in 2003. And then obviously he's using his religious power. He's a cleric who can issue rulings. He's using those rulings to say to people that it is a religious obligation. Those of you who follow me, it is a religious obligation to protest against, the CPA's decision to write a constitution
CPA is
for
the
Iraq.
U.S. Occupation Authority, for those listeners who might be too young to remember the period.
That's right. And I think 20 years later, I still think that Sistani shows power in a way that we've not seen. You refer to the Pope. He does not have the same political power, but we also have clerics and religious leaders in Iran who use their power differently to be formally involved in government. Sistani's model is different to that as well. He does not believe that clerics should assume political power. Instead, their job is to guide, but then also when they have to take a stand, when they need to do something extraordinary, then it is their responsibility to do so. And I think that mode of religious leadership or political religious leadership is different from the other two examples.
Well, that leads to, I think, another one of your central points, which is that Sistani has developed a model of clerical authority that markedly differs from the model developed by the Walayat al-Faqih clerics in Iran. Can you explain what is his view of the role of clerics in wielding political power, and how that view has put him at odds with Khamenei and like-minded folks in Iran?
Yeah, part of this just relates to jurisprudence of Shia Islam. The views on whether people should try to form an Islamic state, a state conforming completely with the rules of Islam. And there's sort of two differing views. One says that that's the job of people with religious learning. Their job is to try to form the best government possible, the best state possible. They're responsible for people. They're responsible for leading them, and that means they need to try to form a state based on Islamic rulings and Islamic teachings. And that is sort of the school that is currently leading the Islamic Republic in Iran, which is to have a state, a government based on Islamic leadership. And the other school says, well, we don't have the divine authority to try to force Islamic governments on people. We are just regular human beings. We're not the prophet nor his successors. But we can guide. And if people want to listen to us and if people want to follow us, then it's our responsibility to give some of that guidance. But we will not call for directly leading and ruling people. So their job is sort of more advice. And I think that's where Sistani's view conforms more. He believes that the role of religious leaders is to advise, to guide, to warn, but not to sort of have a formal constitutional role in politics.
So is it correct to? I mean, in the past, I've read things that describe this approach as quietist, which seems, I think, a little bit of a misnomer because Sistani does believe that clerical rulings are important for their followers. So it's not a question of quietism so much as it is a matter of not wielding direct power or taking roles in government. And I think you also make this really interesting distinction that explains a lot of Sistani's staying power, which is by not putting himself at the center of events and by absolutely eschewing any direct benefit or direct power for himself and his clerical institutions, he maintains voluntary compliance from followers who see him as a disinterested party rather than as someone who's trying to build a power base for himself. Is that an accurate representation of what you find?
Yes, I think that's broadly correct. I think you're right. The misnomer is to say quietist versus sort of activist. Obviously don't agree with the label quietist for Sistani and his colleagues in Najaf. I think he's selective, and I think he believes that the role of religious clerics should be informal in politics rather than formal. And I would say that's probably the distinction. Rather than quietist and activist, formal and informal makes more sense. So he believes that they can speak up, they can certainly speak to their followers. Their job is to speak up, to guide, to advise, and then if there's something of the gravest nature, then to use the power of religious rulings to try to get compliance from the state, which he did when he stood up to Brehmer, and he did when he issued a fatwa, a ruling to tell people that they needed to fight back against ISIS. But certainly for himself, he does not want formal political power. He believes that that's not his job, and it is much too risky. When clerics make mistakes, then it will be the religion itself that will be at fault rather than just an individual leader. And that's his concern. He wants to keep the religion away from politics because politics is messy and mistakes happen and so on, whereas religion should be sort of much purer. That's his viewpoint. So I think formal and informal is probably much more appropriate.
You're listening to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and I'm talking today with Sajad Jiyad about his new book, God's Man in Iraq, a political biography of Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani in Iraq, and an assessment of his legacy and why he's been so important, not just for Shia faithful, millions of Shia faithful worldwide, but for the historical trajectory of Iraq. Sajad, you just referred to the fatwa that mobilized people against ISIS. Can you spin out that example a little more to help us understand how it is that Sistani has, in a very literal way, been so powerful? And I mean, I think maybe even you've used this language to say that in that instance, he single-handedly saved Iraq from dissolution or worse.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Sistani recognizes that he has followers inside the country and beyond, and that people will listen to his words. So he's selective. I think he wants to preserve political capital where possible. I don't think he wants to sort of issue rulings every week and then, watches his political capital dwindle. So I think he's selective, and he's reserved those rulings, the fatwa, for the most gravest circumstances, let's say. And one of those was in 2014. In June 2014, ISIS swept across northern and western Iraq, and it reached, sort of 10, 15 kilometers from Baghdad. And there was concern that, Baghdad would fall. And Sistani at that time realized that this is when he needed to use his leadership, his political capital. The government seemed to be struggling to push back ISIS. We lost, I think, 3 divisions of the Iraqi army, which just completely disappeared. People dropping their weapons and changing into civilian clothes and just disappeared from the streets. And same with the federal police. And I think Sistani recognized the danger that the fear factor was prevalent all throughout Iraq. And it didn't look like international support was coming anytime soon. And the government certainly had made a big mess of dealing with ISIS before the events of June 2014, and it looked like they didn't have a plan. So Sistani stepped in. I think, preserving the life of innocent people is probably his highest priority, and realized that this was the time when people needed to take up arms to defend themselves and defend the country. So he called for volunteers. Because we'd lost so many people from the armed forces, he called people to volunteer to join the army and police, essentially, to take up weapons and to push back ISIS, which is what happened in the end. We had a lot of volunteers, over 100,000 people signed up, able men, able to carry weapons and fight and push back ISIS. And I think that is an example of, him recognizing the danger and saying, this is when I need to step in. This now requires something that government can't do, that regular politicians can't do. This is where I need to use my position as a respected religious leader for millions of people to ask them to do something that, for me, is an obligation, something that they are obliged to listen to and do.
And symptomatically, he stepped in and did this only because of and after a state failure. So it's not that he was stepping in to try and catalyze a security response to ISIS. He only did this when pressed both by events and by, I think, a lot of specific individuals who came to him and asked him to intervene because the government had so abjectly failed to muster forces. And I think in that episode as well, there was another critical role he played, which was in I guess greasing the way for from Prime Minister Maliki to step down and be replaced by Haider al-Abadi, which opened the way for broader international support for the counter-ISIS campaign. And that was another sort of diplomatic intervention by Sistani to persuade or cajole or I don't know how to best describe that, Maliki to finally step down.
Yeah, and that's a use of power sort of behind the scenes, much more informal. There was no sort of very public statement about it. He didn't sort of mention Maliki by name, and he has no role in the constitution. He's not in a position to sort of formally ask a prime minister to resign. But what he did was behind the scenes, as you said, sort of cajoling / threatening in a sense, saying that this is going to make people more angry if you cling on to power. And we will sort of start pointing fingers to say that you're behind the failures in the country. Your refusal to leave the premiership to allow a new government to be formed is the reason why, Iraq is facing collapse. So I think that shows you the other side of how he operates in terms of politics. The movements behind the scenes, using his informal power to sort of make people understand, that he's trying to guide them to the right thing.
Now, if we credit Sistani for saving Iraq in the fatwa that mobilized all the people to fight in 2014 when the official forces had collapsed, should we also hold him responsible for the problematic or even really corrosive long-term tension between the paramilitaries that are now sort of a formal counterweight to the Ministry of Defense under the umbrella of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are a legacy also of that fatwa, and which persistently have hobbled centralized state authority and made it increasingly difficult to ever imagine there being a monopoly of force for the state.
So, I mean, that's a common criticism of Sistani, but it's sort of after the fact. I mean, at that moment in time, what else was supposed to be done? What other options existed? I don't think anybody had any better ideas than asking people to mobilize to join the army and the police, the security forces.
Well, I mean,
And Sistani,
I think I know we've had this debate at length, but it would have been for the fatwa to say people need to join only the official army and police rather than allow them to join these militias.
exactly what the fatwa says. And in the week after, in a speech as well, he says, he uses the word militias. He says, we did not call for people to form militias. So Sistani is very clear. I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue was that, after sort of the liberation of Mosul, after ISIS was essentially sort of defeated as a ground force, people were saying, well, these groups have now, clung on to power. ISIS is gone. Wouldn't Sistani be able to issue another fatwa to say, hey, militias need to disband and people need to sort of go home? And I think that's more probably where the criticism is now aimed. Not that in 2014 he made the wrong move, but now what is he doing? He knows these groups exist. He knows they used some of the legitimacy of the fatwa to align themselves with a common goal of defending Iraq, let's say, but now they're in it for self-interest. What is Sistani going to do about it? And again, it's a sort of a difficult thing to say because these groups are loyal to Iran, let's say, in terms of their political leadership, in terms of their religious leadership. They adhere to Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. They listen to him. And so Sistani is not even able to force them to disband because they don't look to him. And so if he knows that, and it's clear, then what is going to be the effect of his words to ask them to disband when, they don't listen to him anyway? That's the concern. Number two, he's, calling on the state to intervene because he does not want to put himself in a position where the state is so weak constantly and always looking to him for solutions. Because what happens after he's gone? Who is going to be in that position and who needs to take that responsibility to constantly save the government from its failure? So part of what he's done since these groups have sort of become more powerful is to consistently call on government to impose the rule of law, to disband any unauthorized groups, let's say, or outlaw groups, push the government to sort of do a better job of implementing its security policy. And probably that's as much as we can expect. I don't think there is more that Sistani can do to try to sort of suddenly find a way to get rid of sort of militias. It's not really his job. That's the job of government.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about how you reported this book, and what's sort of new and exceptional in the sources you were able to draw on to tell us this story.
Yeah, I mean, so I spent a lot of time in Najaf, since 2003. It's the last 20 years. I've spent a lot of time in Najaf. I've interviewed dozens of scholars and clerics in Najaf, some of Sistani's students, some of his colleagues, people who've worked with him. I've talked to politicians who've interacted with him in Baghdad. I've talked to foreign politicians who had dealings with him via intermediaries. I have looked at all the sort of available sources on Sistani. And I think probably what's new is I was able to pick up information that is not published because, Sistani is quite sort of opaque in a certain sense. He doesn't sort of publish a lot of his own work. He doesn't speak in public, doesn't really appear in public. There's an official biography, but beyond that, sort of very difficult to pick up any open source information on Sistani. So I had to, through the years, collect tidbits, things that I would hear from people, some anecdotes. I've met Sistani a few times in Najaf, London, when he went for healthcare treatment in 2004, medical treatment. And there are things that you notice about him when you're in close proximity, but he doesn't like to grant interviews. He doesn't give anybody sort of an interview, an hour long where you can present a list of questions. That's not the way it works. Instead, we have these sort of questions that came in after 2003 from, various wire services and newspapers who'd sent questions to his office, and they were written questions. But in terms of trying to pick up a lot of detail on what he wants to say, he's very guarded and very careful. So you have to sort of use these other sources, and I've just been collecting them the last 20 years, putting stuff away for the right time. And I think since sort of about March 2020, since the onset of COVID, Sistani has been much less active. And I thought now is the sort of time to bring all this information to light.
And a lot of the texts that you've translated here, that you've collected and translated, that are primary texts, are appearing for the first time, maybe in any language. Is that right? In a published work that's available to
Correct. I mean,
scholars?
exactly. The statements from his office, the Friday prayer speeches delivered by his representatives. Some of this is appearing in English, at least for the first time. And I think it's important for us to have a body of work that says, here's what Sistani says. This is so relevant and important to Iraq. I think it's going to open up some of his work or his statements and his positions to a wide audience.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have time to go into detail of some of the other examples like we did on the fatwa. But time and again, one of the critical roles he's played has really been in deflating both intra-Shia conflict and also sectarian conflict, and that's, I think, going to be understood to be one of the real seminal contributions of his leadership, is essentially being an anti-sectarian Shia cleric who used his influence to try and minimize sectarian violence. And I hope that that's a piece of his legacy that finds emulators after he's gone.
Yes, exactly right. I think, when a time when sectarianism was the political currency in Iraq, Sistani was the only one who was actively sort of pushing against it and refused to be engaged in it, and sort of chastised the politicians that were using sectarian language and using sectarian politics to try to win votes and to assume positions. I think he contributed immensely to showing people this is what a religious leader is supposed to be doing. Not to be involved acting in politics and trying to court people to his side or to push people against each other, but to actually try to have a form of communal leadership, as we put it. And I think this is absolutely right. The point you make about his legacy, I think this is an important contributing factor to his legacy. But it also leads us to sort of a question. So what happens after Sistani? Will whoever succeeds him be like him? Will they follow in his footsteps? And I think that's a concern many people have as well.
Well, so how old is Sistani today?
93.
93. And well, okay. So tell us how does succession work for this incredibly powerful but sort of vaguely defined role of top cleric in the Hausa?
I mean, so it's informal. I mean, there isn't sort of an election. There isn't the procedure, say, that the Vatican has. It's not like that at all. It just sort of means that, we have a period of time where we're waiting for successors to emerge. Maybe people coalesce around one or several clerics at the same time. Certainly, Sistani's left what I would like to say. He's left a legacy of what I would call the Sistani paradigm. And I like to say it's the way to do business, the way to behave, the way a religious cleric should lead. And I think that is going to be the defining factor for whoever comes after him, is how closely do they adhere to the Sistani paradigm? That the fact that he doesn't speak too often, he tries to avoid taking sides. He certainly, pushes away from sectarianism. He keeps away from formal politics and having a formal role, and trying to, act as a leader for all Iraqis. I think this mode, this way of doing things is probably what's going to define who his successor will be.
Well, so you argue that sort of quiet form of authority is one of the reasons why he has been so influential and been so critical to stabilizing Iraq through a series of crises. Now, in the contest to succeed him, which I think you say could unfold over many years after his death, it's not that there's going to be an instant successor chosen by acclamation. There'll be some long process that could last many years. Will we see some people, some clerics competing for this role who want to deploy a much more robust Walayat al-Faqih Iranian style approach to leadership in contrast to the model that Sistani created?
Not from inside Iraq, I don't think so. I think certainly there will be clerics inside Iran who want to promote that view. I think the Iranian regime certainly wants to have somebody in Najaf that is going to sort of be closer to its ideology. But I don't think, Najaf right now, or the senior scholars who are in Najaf right now, will deviate from Sistani's view. I think they will back and continue on sort of his path, which is to say, hey, like you say, quiet power, we work behind the scenes. Our job is not to be involved directly in government. And I think that is also probably what's more acceptable to most people in the Shia world, is to have clerics who are not sort of formally part of government. So in the future, I think the Iranians will try to, maybe after Sistani is gone, to promote in Iraq an alternative view. But I think they will struggle. And certainly right now, we don't see any senior clerics in Iraq, in Najaf, calling for anything but what Sistani has already been saying.
Who are the most prominent, plausible successors?
So, I mean, in the book, there's a chapter dedicated to sort of what happens after Sistani and, the selection process, not selection process, but the succession process. And, we talk about some of his students, people who've studied under Sistani, people who are close to his office, who are the right age. They're in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, and sort of fit the criteria and would certainly adhere to what I call the Sistani paradigm. And then, there's also a wider pool of senior clerics in Najaf who might not be sort of very close to Sistani, but have the right religious credentials, certainly have sort of the academic, if you want to call it that way, the academic history. They have these large classes, they have many students, they have sort of popular appeal, let's say. But it's very difficult to sort of put your hand or your finger on any one name and say it's definitely going to be, he's the favorite, or it's definitely going to be that person. And I think that's probably also something that Najaf wants to keep, that tradition where sort of they leave it up to people eventually to coalesce around one leader rather than sort of have a very, in a sense, hereditary kind of succession. One appoints the other after his death, or the senior clerics just nominate and elect a new senior leader. And I think that is something special about Najaf.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the fascinating things in this book, and I learned a lot from your discussion of this. And a couple of things that I thought were especially interesting. One was this idea that in past successions, there's been a sort of passing to a regent, like when an elderly Marja passes, someone who's very old will end up being designated by the community as the top authority, someone who only has a few more years left to live, in order to create a longer transition period before the torch passes to a new generation. And the other thing that you write about that I thought was really interesting as well is that, I mean, a cleric like Sistani wields a tremendous amount of power, including through the through the alms that they gather from the faithful, which they disperse through their network of charities. And that is a tool that a cleric like Sistani could use by designating who collects those alms after his passing. He could essentially tilt the scale in favor of a chosen successor. And it seems from what you say that that's not a thing that's been done or that he's likely to do as well, which I find fascinating, because it's like a voluntary choice to decline using a tool that could allow him to essentially pick his successor, even though he's not doing it officially.
Yeah, I think that, there's good reasons why that's the case. I think the concern has always been that the government will various governments over the history of Shia Islam will attempt to impose their will attempt to empower one marja, one senior leader, and then sort of form a way of gaining control over the hawza and then passing it on from one cleric that they like to another. And so the hawza's sort of self-defense mechanism is to say, well, it's sort of difficult. One marja can't say suddenly he is the successor after me. We don't have that. And that prevents attempts at infiltration. And I think Sistani is likely to keep that tradition up. Certainly, I think, like I say, the Sistani paradigm, the Sistani way of doing things is going to have sort of figures that are acceptable. And I think these figures, these clerics will find acceptance, they'll find support from Sistani's office, people close to Sistani after his death to say, hey, these are the names that are acceptable, or these are the names that we would like to support and we would like people to support. I think it works more that way rather than Sistani willing or not willing to sort of nominate one direct successor.
And I guess the last question I'll ask, since we're close to the end of our time, is do you worry that Iraq itself or even the wider region will face bigger dangers of instability, spreading conflict, sectarian conflict, in the absence of Sistani, who's been so pivotal at de-escalating dangers throughout his tenure?
I mean, certainly I think his death creates a period where, the next most senior cleric is not going to be as established or as prepared. It creates a window for, not confusion, I would say, but it creates a window where people are questioning who is the real authority out there in terms of, at least from Najaf's perspective. And can we have multiple leaders at the same time? And what if they have different views? I think that is a concern. Obviously, the concern is that Iran will also want to play a role in this. I think they have a keen interest on who emerges from Najaf. But certainly, I think Sistani's power, Sistani's political capital, Sistani's character is impeccable. And I think it will take time for whoever succeeds him, if there is eventually one successor or if there are several, to build that up. So in that meantime, I think people will, after his death, may be sort of not looking to Najaf for leadership. And there is the potential, if there is further instability in Iraq or the Middle East, I think that there is a potential for Sistani to be missed in that circumstance.
Well, Sajad, thank you so much for coming on to talk about your path-breaking research into Ayatollah Sistani. Listeners can find your book, God's Man in Iraq, The Life and Leadership of Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, in Arabic and in English at booksellers everywhere, online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble or IndieBound, and on our website, tcf.org, the Century Foundation's website. And the book, as I mentioned, is available in Arabic as well. Sajad, thank you so much for your contribution to our understanding of Sistani and for taking the time to help us understand it better as well.
Thank you, Thanasi, for the opportunity. Thanks to TCF for publishing the book. And I hope readers out there find it as enjoyable to read as I did writing and researching on it.
You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Until next time. The Order from Ashes podcast has been brought to you by Century International. Our work builds on more than 100 years of commitment to international peace, security, and governance at the Century Foundation. We are independent, critical, and progressive. For more information about Century International's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We depend on audience feedback to reach new listeners. If you like what you hear, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.